Welcome to the Beyond Barriers podcast. If you're an ambitious woman who wants to dominate your career, then you are in the right place. This podcast is co-hosted by Nikki Barua, digital innovator, serial entrepreneur, author, and speaker, and Monica Marquez, ex-Googler, diversity expert, and senior corporate leader. From inspiring stories to cutting-edge strategies, you'll learn how to develop the skill set, mindset, and tool set to get future-ready fast and accelerate your success. Hi, I'm Monica Marquez, your host for today's episode. Have you ever chosen a path that you want to follow and you set out with determined commitment only to realize somewhere along the way that you're just not enjoying it? What do? Do you keep going, or do you make the tough decision to change directions even if there are sunk costs? Well, in this episode, Judith Williams, Head of People Sustainability and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at SAP, shares her perspective and the important life lessons she learned on the economic principle of sunk costs and how it can also be an important career strategy. Judith shares her story of deciding to make a career pivot, leaving her well-established career as an academic professor to becoming a change agent in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Judith has been at the forefront of the culture change movement in technology and entertainment, with a deep focus on analytics and strategies to identify and disrupt bias in social systems and corporate culture. Prior to joining SAP, she ran an organization which consults with startups, venture capitalists, and accelerators on embedding diversity and inclusion into the foundations of their organizational cultures. In addition, Judith also served as the global head of diversity for Dropbox and was also a diversity programs manager at Google, where she directed the unconscious bias workstream and built strategies for recruiting, retention, and the advancement of the company's technical employees. Visit iambeyondbarriers.com, where you'll find show notes and links to all the resources referenced in this episode, including the best way to get in touch with Judith. Welcome, Judith. Thank you so much for joining us on the Beyond Barriers podcast. We are thrilled to have you here. I want to give you as much time to share your story and share all your pearls of wisdom with our listeners, because I know through your very seasoned career, you have gained lots of perspective in the sense of working for different organizations, working in different industries, and I think with that comes some very unique skill sets that you've developed. So without further ado, share your story and what you've learned along your journey, and maybe one or two lessons that you would love to impart with our audience.
Oh, thank you, Monica. I'd be happy to share a little bit about my story. I know everybody has a story, and you get used to telling your own story so many times. So it's interesting to think about, well, where do you dive in? And I have a former career as an academic. And so about 15 or 16 years ago, I decided I no longer wanted to be an academic. And the most important lesson that I learned at that point, there were two really key things, key ideas. One is the advice that I had been given about how to select a career was wrong. And what I mean by that is we will often tell young people, do what you love and you'll be happy. And I did. I thought, I love books. I love learning. I got a PhD in theater and performance studies. I love theater. I thought I would be set. But I was deeply unhappy as a professor. And what I didn't know was that I had to choose not only what I loved, but what were the terms of my life that I wanted to have. So who did I want to work with? What type of work did I want to do? What type of impact did I want to have? Did I want to work in a collaborative way or a hierarchical way? I realized that I wanted to be more collaborative. I realized I wanted to have a larger direct impact on the world. I wanted to see that my work had impact on not the one-to-one student that you might hear about 15 or 20 years later, but direct impact on things that were happening in the world. I didn't want to live an academic lifestyle where you are so specialized that you have to go where the job is. You have no control over your geographic destiny. And so when I left academia, I knew I wanted to move back to California, which is where I had grown up, where I'd gone to high school. And since I moved back, I've worked for a half a dozen different organizations, including, some of my own. and I haven't left my apartment. So I'm able to, have that geographic. So I would say really be thoughtful about the terms that you want to live your life on. Like really think about what kind of impact you want to have on the world, how you want to work, who you want to work with. Do you want to travel? Think about how much money you want to make and what money actually means to you. Because sometimes, and certainly as I thought of myself as an intellectual who was something above thinking about finances, and then I could have a really creative job and money would happen. And I realized that actually I wanted more things than that. I have an amazing shoe collection, which I never could have had. And so you have to understand that it's about the professional success. It's about the people with whom you surround yourself, but it's also sometimes about what are the material comforts that'll make you happy. So I think that was a really important lesson for me. And the second lesson that was really important in making that career change was understanding sunk cost. This was the most important economic principle to my life. Because when I made the decision, people would say to me, oh, but you've already put so much time in. Now you've got a PhD and you've been teaching, and why are you going to waste all that lost time? And what sunk cost teaches us is just because you put in a lot doesn't mean you should put in more, because what you put in is gone. You have to think about, well, what am I going to get out of this in the future? Not how am I going to recoup this past? It's a bad financial strategy, but it's also a bad career strategy. So I think those were really important lessons for me making that career transition.
That is such tangible advice because, I've heard before, it's very similar to you in terms of sunk cost, of hearing that sometimes you've got to let go of the good in order to attain the great. Right. And so it seems like you really did think about the whole, you were decisive in that way. So I know that a lot of the times when we are coaching a lot of our female clients, they struggle with making tough decisions. And so how did you go about making that really tough decision of, okay, I know I'm doing this. I've invested so much time, energy, and education in pursuing the career that you had. How did you do that kind of risk analysis, or kind of like, how did you weigh out the pros and cons and then decide, okay, I'm just, I'm making the switch? How did you, what is your technique? What's your tactic? What advice would you give women when they're coming up to a really kind of pivotal decision like that?
I was very unhappy. I think that was one of the things. I had been an academic. I'd been teaching at a university that was really well run, and I left that university for a university that was much less well run. And so I knew that I'd gone from working conditions that were tolerable to working conditions that were intolerable. And I knew there were things about the job that I wasn't happy about. But when I'd been working at a university that had a strong infrastructure to support faculty, it allowed me to have an easier time of it. So wasn't completely content. So I would say that shift, that understanding that even in the best of circumstances, doing that job, I wasn't happy. And then I went to what for me were the worst of circumstances. So I realized how bad it could get. And there's something about that change. I think that you can be what I call low grade miserable for your entire life.
Yes.
But you can't hold despair. Right? That's just not a way to live. So that was one thing that was very helpful. So I knew at that point that I had to change my life because I couldn't live with that unhappiness. And so I was faced with this idea of, well, do I go back on the academic job market and get another academic job? Or do I make a different change? And I thought about what I had done. I had tried public universities, private universities in different geographies. I had tried different departments in different universities. And so I knew that it wasn't the department, it wasn't the type of university, it wasn't the location of the job that was really causing my dissatisfaction. It was something else. So, and I would say, if anything, I knew before that I was unhappy, but I kept listening to other people. And so I'd say you have to find that place in yourself because no one is going to understand what drives you and what makes you content. We can certainly talk to our mentors and our coaches and get advice, but it has to sit well with you. And I stayed longer than I would have because of all of the people telling me, oh, you should stay, just try harder. So I would say that's the first thing, is to listen to what's important to you. And the way that I found that voice for myself was I thought about the person that I was when I was 16. And that girl thought she could do anything. And I realized that I was not living in a way that would have made me a good role model for her. I was living in a way that my 16-year-old self would not have respected. And I actually thought, well, that's pretty terrible, because that was a great kid and she deserves role models that look like her. And you know what? The next generation of great young people deserve role models that look like them. And you can't be a good role model if you're deeply unhappy and unsatisfied with the work you're doing. So you've got to think about, how do you live up to be someone that your younger self could respect? And for me, that was very compelling. And I still check in with that sense of that person that I was, who really believed, and I was really fortunate growing up with a family that taught me I could do anything. And so if you have this foundation where you could do anything and you're doing something that makes you unhappy, well, that's not success.
Right. That is such insightful kind of self-reflection that you did. And I think, it is so true that you have to remind yourself sometimes that you have to live it to lead it, right? And if you're not living it, then how are you supposed to step into that and lead and be a role model for others? I think that's absolutely fantastic. One of the questions I have for you is that you did make a significant transition in terms of leaving academia and going into the corporate world, or how did you get clarity on what your strengths, your competencies, and being able to align it to your purpose in a sense, and really then be able to tell your story to these corporations in terms of making that transition? How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, that was actually really hard, because I didn't know how to tell my story initially, because as an academic, I didn't actually understand what was going to be compelling to corporate entities. And so I had to learn. So I did a number of things. One, I started to learn, well, what is this business world? I didn't even think of like a corporation. I was like, business. I want to work in business. What is a business? And a friend had said to me once, if you want to understand how business people think, you should read the newspaper that business people read. So I got a subscription to the Wall Street Journal, began to read it, and just cover every day. That was my practice, just to understand what is this, right? Like, what's the profit of what? So what do they care about? So that was one. And then I also reached out to friends and peers who I knew had gone to business school or were working in some of these mysterious business places. Right. I said, look, I need help. I don't know what I want to do. And I believed at that point that my rubric for deciding what to do was broken, because I had used the rubric that I had, do what you love. It had left me unhappy. I didn't know what to do. So I began to think about what do I think would possibly solve some of the problems that I have. And so one, I knew that I had no control over my geography. So I wanted to go into a field where I could get a new job and not have to move. So that was one thing. Very simple, right? Yeah. I also knew that I worked in a way that was incredibly hierarchical when I was working with students, solitary when I was doing research. And I wanted to work in a collaborative, less hierarchical way. So I knew that. I knew that I really loved to travel. And there was this mysterious business travel thing that I was really interested in. And so I was like, I wanted travel to be a part of what I did. I also knew that as a professor, I was really good in front of an audience, because that's what I had been doing. Right. And so I wanted to find something that would leverage some of the skills that I already had. I didn't want to have to start completely at the bottom and buy someone coffee. Like that's sort of what I said. And I deliberately, I can make coffee now, but I didn't learn how to make coffee until I was much older. And so I knew these things. And then I talked to my friends in business and I said, these are the things that I know. Can you help me? And I had a couple friends who said, well, these are the types of jobs where people do some of the things that you want. They have to do these other things that you might not know about. But that's really what I did. And then one of the most important support pieces that I got from a friend was I had an academic CV, which is 6 to 8 pages.
Right.
And he took my academic CV and he helped me translate it into a language that people in a corporate entity, people in business would actually understand. So you look at things like, okay, I had run research projects with research assistants. He was like, you manage small teams. He was like, and he said, and I had applied for grants, and then I had to manage grants, and he was like, ran small P&Ls, right? Like, so all of these, because I didn't know that language, and so he helped me by having those conversations. Say, okay, I understand a little bit about what you want. There's a lot of things that fill that. So good, you're not being too picky, because you can't be that picky at this point. And here are how your skills translate into something that makes sense or will make sense to a recruiter or a manager who's going to read your CV.
That's so fantastic. And your story resonates so much with me only because I think we've lived parallel lives. I too was in academia before I went into the corporate space. And I was, after I got my master's, I packed up and I moved to New York City, and I was working at NYU. And someone, just again, a referral, kind of someone in my network happened to be a recruiter at Goldman Sachs, reached out to me and said, hey, I think there's this role that would be great for you. And like you, I didn't know anything about the business world or Wall Street. And yes, I lived in New York City, but I'd only been there for a few years. And I remember asking her, and this is going to sound crazy, but I asked her, who's Goldman Sachs? And she was like, do you have any friends who went to B school? And I'm like, yeah. She's like, call them up and tell them you have a potential opportunity and you're thinking about not taking it. And of course, when I called my friends, the first thing out of their mouth was, I said, hey, I have this opportunity at some place called Goldman Sachs. And they were like, hang up the phone, call the recruiter, tell them yes, and then call me back and tell me what the job is. And so that was my story into getting exposed to corporate. But once I said yes, and once I got the job, I found myself in a sea of just extremely smart people, Ivy League degrees. I was not like them. And there was certainly imposter syndrome and a sense of doubt. Now, once you made it into the corporate space, how did you, did you have any fears, limiting beliefs, kind of imposter syndrome? And if so, how did you overcome them or get past them?
So one of the things, and I mentioned this before, is I grew up with my grandparents, and they inspired in me this idea that you can do anything, but it takes hard work. And so when I was a child and I would get frustrated, or something was hard, they would always reframe it if I didn't do it. And they would say, well, did you put in the work? Have you done the work? And so what I realized is that anything I wanted to do, it's about how much work are you willing to put in. You put in the hours and the work and you learn, right? And you think about, that's how I approach everything, which is, I might not know how to do it, but I can learn it. The question is not, can I do it, but am I willing to put in the work that it takes to actually be good at this thing? And sometimes the answer to that is no. But if it's always about the work, then it's not about you. And then even if you do the work and you fail the first time, the answer is, well, let's put in more work.
Right.
And so that's how I looked at the change, which is I have a lot to learn. I have to put in the work. And that has served me really well. And when you have, as we all do, we do things that just don't work out, or you have a project and you miss something. I look at it and I say, okay, where did I not put in the work, or where did I do the wrong work? What have I learned so that the next time I can do the right work to be successful? So that has really helped me, is that consistently reframing something in terms of not doubting whether or not I can do it, but always understanding that it's, am I willing to do all the work? Sometimes it's more work than we want to do, and that's fair. But if we want to be successful at something, we've got to put in the work.
That's fantastic. And so thinking about a little about, putting in the work and getting it done, what are some of your kind of success habits? Like, what is a daily ritual that you do that helps you stay on that A game or putting in the work? Like, how do you, what does your day look like, and what are some of the habits that you practice in order to be successful?
It's the habits that I practice are, I think part of it is some of the mental health care that I do. And what I try to do is to do something physical every day. And usually it's walking or running. And the reason why I like walking or running is because it's very meditative. And so if I do it at the start of the day, it allows me to think through what I want to do with the day, right? And to sometimes work out difficult problems. If I do it at the end of the day, it allows me to separate from what's been going on, especially if there's something that I've really been struggling with.
Right.
Then that kind of physical separation. And I've taught myself that physical activity, it's meditative, but it's also deep thinking. And so that really helps me a lot. Some of that's my ideation time. One of the I think challenges is the more senior you get, the less maker time you get, and the more manager time you have to spend. Right. And so, our manager time are those half-hour blocks where we're talking to other people. It's really hard to dig into hard projects and think about the strategy or the even execution of complex projects when you just don't get those significant blocks of time to think them through. And so what I find is that if I can get a run or walk in, it allows me to have some of that maker time that's very free flowing that helps inform the work that I'm going to do. So I think that's a really essential. It's been difficult recently because I'm in California and we couldn't go outside for a few days. But as soon as I woke up this morning and the air was clear again, first thing I did is run. I also get up really early, and I would get up early even if I didn't have to, even if I don't have meetings, because I know that I'm clearest in the morning. The other thing that I think is really important is I try to do the awful task first. So the thing that I'm dreading, the thing that I'm like, I do that. Because that's where you need to be most fresh. That's where you probably you want to cut corners because you don't enjoy it. Right. And so do the awful task first, and then the tasks that are easier, they become almost a reward.
Right. Oh, I love that. Yes. And it is that daunting thing where I'm the worst. I will procrastinate. And in my mind, for some reason, like the more I push it off, then the less time I have to, expend on it. But then sometimes that just blows up in my face. So I think maybe I have to take your habit into consideration and just do those things first and get them out of the way.
Do you want to grow your impact as a change agent who ignites transformation in others, but you don't have a proven step-by-step method? Do you want to grow your visibility and influence as a thought leader to inspire others, but you don't know where to begin? The Beyond Barriers High Performance Executive Coach Certification is designed for experienced leaders who want to grow their impact and influence. Join this exclusive community of high achievers, advance your career as a leader, and experience the joy of helping others grow. Go to iambeyondbarriers.com and register for the webinar to learn more.
Shifting gears a little bit, thinking about, even in your various different roles, you've gone from various different companies, like Google to SAP, all of these different organizations. And there's, definitely a culture shift or sometimes a culture shock, just given the current company's culture. But how have you established or gained access to kind of influential leaders and built relationships in new organizations when you may have gained a lot of traction in one particular organization and have a lot of social capital? How do you do that? What has helped you gain access to influential leaders and build a strong network or community around yourself?
It varies depending on the culture of an organization. I think the first thing when you join an organization is to listen. And much more than you talk. Right. To try to understand the lay of the land, to try to understand whose agendas are at play, and that I think is one step. And then to think about, if you're thinking about building a relationship over the long term, you really want initially to show your value. And sometimes the way that we want to show our value is we do a lot. We're like, look, I'm valuable. Right. But what we've got to understand is that relationships are reciprocal, and that you also need other people need to or want to show you their value. Right. And so that opportunity to listen is to essentially get some of that, to understand the value of others, and not from a like, we only care about people for the value, but we all want to, I think, contribute to our organizations. And so understanding that it's reciprocal. And so you look for opportunities to show your value, but you also look for opportunities to provide others, to highlight others' value or to show their value.
Right.
I think those are really important. And then I've had a lot of success in connecting with peers, and often I just ask, what's it like here? Who should I talk to? What types of people are successful here? And that's, again, people will give you that advice, and they want to give you that advice, because when you join an organization, everybody wants you to be successful. You're in recruiting, the cost of a bad hire. No one wants that. And so if you take that time to listen and to get that advice, and then to meet as many people as possible, it's really, it's important. It's one of the reasons why for my job I traveled a lot. Now it's, I think one of my fundamental assumptions before COVID was that go sit down with someone, be in the same room, break bread, be a human in the same room, and as much as you can get that face time in a distributed organization, because that's what is going to take you through long term. It's interesting now that we can't do that. I haven't traveled for work in 6 months.
Right.
And so those meetings that we would normally have, those sidebar conversations, they're much harder to have. So you have to work harder to check in on people. Ask them about their work. Ask them, is there something I can do that would that you've wanted, that you've needed, right?
Right.
And so that's generally been how I've learned about the organization and learned about what other people need in the organization.
That's really great advice. I mean, digging in a little deeper to this kind of disruptive, immediately change of work environment. You and I both know, working in diversity, equity, and inclusion, that, in a regular utopic work environment, just Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latinos, sometimes did have a bit of a challenge, because they were underrepresented groups in very kind of in a lot of organizations, male, white, cisgender dominated populations. Now that things have kind of shifted virtual, and there's a little bit more of a barrier in terms of being able to have those kind of face-to-face meetings, or kind of just those, just those great, happenstance run-ins in the hallway. Have you seen, any trends, or, just these underrepresented groups, minorities, women especially, being disproportionately impacted by this kind of COVID environment?
I mean, we've seen the impact in lots of different ways. And part of it, one of the things that we've been doing is a remote pulse survey to just check in and see how different employees are doing. So we are seeing, certainly women tend to be primary caregivers more so than men. And so we are seeing some differences there. We know that when you have this kind of virtual setup, when you hear about someone leaving the organization, it has a much bigger impact, because that one or two people who leave, it seems like everybody's leaving, but that's not true. So I would say, if we look at the data, we haven't seen an aggregate difference, but what we're hearing anecdotally, or certainly what we're hearing is about the stress on women who are caregivers. We're hearing about, interestingly enough, people who are living alone, who are dealing with mental health challenges and loneliness. And so we are hearing about those differences in our survey, but then we're hearing anecdotally that people are feeling isolated. And if you think about the way that this started, we thought, it's a few weeks.
Right.
It's a few months.
Right.
Now we don't know.
Right. There's no end in sight. Right.
Exactly. And so it's the realization. And so I think that a lot of the short-term strategies that organizations put in place, or that individuals had put in place, we're going to see longer term. So we have, we're hearing anecdotally about some differences, but I think it'll hit our data much later. So we haven't seen trends yet, but I believe we will.
And a little bit about, as you and I both know, because this is a crisis, right? We have the pandemic with COVID, but then there was definitely increased racial tensions with Black Lives Matter, those types of things. But we know that crisis also creates opportunities. What are the biggest opportunities that you see for women of color, people of color, that as a result of kind of this forced conversation now, in a sense of, being able to elevate their voice?
What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think there's an opportunity for, as you said, the elevation of the voice. And what we see is leaders are listening in a way that perhaps they didn't listen before. And they are open to a different type of conversation. And we see that there seems to be an opening for greater communication across difference. There seems to be an opening for more empathy. And then what we're hearing, or what we've heard from our employees, is they want more. And so they want to know what we are doing to develop our employees from underrepresented groups, and not just employees from underrepresented groups. We have, all of our employees saying, no, we have to not only contribute to these external organizations, but we've really got to take a look at what's happening on our teams. Why aren't we getting more diversity in our pipeline? Why aren't we seeing more diversity in leadership? So I think that it is an opportunity to really have that conversation for people willing to say we have to do something differently because this is not okay. I would say that was not the kind of frank and honest conversation that we were having a year ago.
Right. I think that's extremely insightful. And I think it's, almost a call to action for individuals to be able to kind of, use this opportunity to make sure that they are speaking up and speaking out so that, those who are truly now open to listening can hear those messages and we can start addressing those issues. Thinking about talking about this shift in work environment, what advice do you give to people in terms of, the agility? Like, how have you, in terms of having to be nimble and thinking about, okay, the work environment has shifted. Probably I would, assume that your, 2020, goals for your organization and your team were kind of out the window after this happened. How do you stay agile? How do you stay learning and ahead of the curve in these situations?
I don't know that we managed to stay ahead of the curve. I think that we're just trying to keep up, right? We're trying to keep the car on the rails. I think part of it is to think about, do you have an overriding philosophy or infrastructure for solving problems? And for me, and this might be true of you, having had that Google exposure, is it's always the data. So I always keep myself very mired in the data. And because the temptation now, when there's a lot of attention, is to do everything and see what sticks on the wall. And what we really have to do is have the discipline to say, look, if our data tells us that things have changed, then we need to pivot. But what we've seen is anecdotal information. We're going to use it. Because there are some things that we have to do in the moment. So we did have to have town halls in June and July because of what was going on. We have started doing sharing circles to give our employees a space to come together around these very difficult topics. But in terms of our core strategy, which was based in the data and solving some really key problems, we still need to solve those problems. And so our infrastructure is still valid and our strategy is still valid. And what we need to do is to have the discipline to say, yeah, it's very tempting to pivot and to go another direction, but the strategy was solid. It doesn't mean that we don't react or respond to immediate needs, but we had a solid strategy and we're going to continue to drive on it.
Right. The solutions may change, but the strategy and the kind of the focus that you had is still there. That makes absolute sense. We like to ask all our podcast guests this question all the time in terms of thinking about women and accelerating their success. What advice would you give women, in this kind of current digital age and this environment where things keep changing and shifting? What advice would you give them to that would help them accelerate their success and stay, like you said, either keep the car on the rails, keep it on the track, or getting ahead of the curve a bit?
So I think one of the things that we see among women is this idea that the work is enough. And the work is really important, but you also have to make sure your work is visible. And the more senior you get, the more your job shifts to making your work visible and then making the work of your team visible. And especially in this type of moment, you have to make your work visible. And if it's not visible, it's that tree falling in the forest and anyone here. That's what happens to work. And I've seen so many men who will spend the time talking to managers and everyone about how great they are and sending out the email about like this great success that they've had and having the meeting to be like, here's this great thing that I did. And women are shaking their heads going, but what about me? And it's like, you've got to understand that part of the job is talking about the work. And if it's uncomfortable for you to talk about yourself and the work that you did, a mind hack that you can do is to think about you're talking about your best friend. Because for most of us, if we have a best friend, we can tell you everything she's done. We are the best champion in the world. No one is better than that best friend. So when you talk about your own work, talk about your work like you're your own best friend.
I love that hack. Yes, because I think that is one of the biggest roadblocks or barriers that we see with women is the art of self-promotion and not being able to tell their own story. And in some cases, because they don't tell their story, when they have the opportunity, they've never crafted that story to share it. So I completely agree with you and love the advice in terms of visibility, and visibility matters. And with that, thank you so much for your time on the Beyond Barriers podcast. You have given some really insightful and great advice that I know our listeners are going to be thrilled to get. And with that, I know that we are going to have listeners who will reach out and say, hey, I'd love to get in contact with Judith or connect with her. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
To reach out to me on LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn. And so I usually try to respond to messages on LinkedIn. I'm not on LinkedIn every day, but I do go through them every couple of days.
Fantastic. Judith, thanks again for sharing your wisdom and your story. And it's absolutely inspirational. And we hope that many women will learn from this.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond Barriers podcast. There are thousands of podcasts out there, and we are so grateful that you've chosen to listen to ours. If you enjoyed the show, please tell a friend about it and subscribe to get new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Visit IamBeyondBarriers.com, where you'll find show notes and links to all resources for each show, including the best way to connect with our guests. See you next episode.